At precisely 6:30 in the morning on May 10, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Wendell Fertig stood motionless at the periphery of a dense jungle clearing on the island of Mindanao. Before him, a tragic tableau unfolded as long, ragged columns of American and Filipino soldiers were force-marched toward captivity. In total, nearly 78,000 men were in the process of capitulating, marking the largest surrender in American history. Fertig was 41 years old, a civilian mining engineer originally from Colorado who had been commissioned into the Army Corps of Engineers. He was not a career soldier. He had spent the previous 6 years in the Philippines constructing essential infrastructure, roads and bridges, for private mining concerns, giving him an intimate knowledge of the terrain. The Imperial Japanese Army had descended upon Mindanao with overwhelming tactical superiority, crushing organized resistance. General William Sharp, the commander of American forces in the region, had just capitulated, signing the official surrender order that compelled every unit on the island to lay down their arms. The directive was absolute. Every American soldier was to disarm and report immediately to the nearest Japanese garrison. The penalty for noncompliance was explicit and brutal. Those who refused would be designated as fugitives, hunted down without mercy, and summarily executed. Yet, Fertig understood the grim reality of what surrender actually entailed. Harrowing reports of the Bataan Death March had already filtered down to Mindanao through the bamboo telegraph. The island's informal network of rumors and resistance intelligence. The news painted a picture of systematic atrocity. Thousands of American and Filipino prisoners perishing along that 60-mile trek of horror. There were accounts of men being bayoneted simply for falling behind the column, buried alive for the crime of stopping to drink from a roadside ditch, or beheaded arbitrarily by their captors. It became clear that the Japanese forces were not merely taking prisoners of war in accordance with international law. They were acquiring slave labor. As Fertig watched the final column of defeated soldiers vanish down the muddy, rain-slicked road, he weighed a binary choice. He could walk into a Japanese prison camp and face a high probability of death by starvation or disease, or he could walk into the jungle and face the certainty of being hunted like an animal. Without a word, he turned his back on the road and disappeared into the tree line. Mindanao offered a formidable sanctuary. As the second largest island in the Philippine archipelago, it encompassed 36,000 square miles of rugged volcanic mountains, dense rainforests, and malaria-ridden swamps, a landmass larger than the state of Indiana. While the Japanese occupation forces firmly controlled the coastal cities, ports, and major roadways, the vast, untamed interior remained a completely different world, effectively beyond their reach. It was a complex human landscape comprising tribal villages isolated in the volcanic highlands, fierce Muslim communities in the south, the Moros, who had resisted foreign invaders for 400 years, and Christian Filipino farmers who harbored a deep, simmering hatred for the Japanese occupation. Somewhere within that green labyrinth, Fertig knew there were others, Americans who had also refused the order to surrender and were now scattered in the mountains. At that moment, Fertig possessed no weapons, no radio equipment, no food rations, no currency, and no soldiers to command. His only assets were his civil engineering training and a deep, accumulated understanding of the Filipino people he had lived and worked alongside for 6 years. The Imperial Japanese Army maintained a stranglehold on Mindanao, garrisoning 50,000 troops to enforce their new order. Their control was absolute, extending over every deepwater port, airfield, and major urban center, while their naval vessels and armored units patrolled the coastlines with impunity. For those who dared to resist, the occupation force implemented a policy of calculated terror. Capture was almost invariably followed by public execution, often utilizing the brutal methods of decapitation or burning alive to serve as a grim deterrent. Within weeks of the American surrender, Japanese patrols began aggressively sweeping the jungle, weaponizing the local population by offering bounties for betrayed Americans and incinerating entire villages suspected of harboring fugitives. During these initial weeks, Fertig was in no condition to fight. Ravaged by malaria and fever, he sought refuge in the hidden camp of Jacob Dacier, an elderly American expatriate who had lived in the Philippines since the Spanish-American War. From his concealment, Fertig became a silent witness to the dismantling of a nation. He watched helpless columns of prisoners stumbling down the roads. He witnessed Filipino civilians being beaten in the streets for failing to bow to Japanese sentries. It was in this crucible of helplessness that a seemingly impossible idea began to take root in his fevered mind. He began to question the inevitability of defeat. He wondered if the fragmented, demoralized groups of Americans scattered throughout the jungle could be reorganized into a cohesive unit. He envisioned unifying the disparate Filipino resistance factions, tribesmen, farmers, and soldiers, under a single, centralized command. The concept was logistically absurd. Building a functioning army from scratch, deep within enemy territory, with no supply lines, no weaponry, and no communication with the Allied powers. Fertig, a civil engineer with zero combat command experience, recognized the insanity of the proposition. He possessed no legal authority to issue orders, yet in July 1942, he made a decision that would either liberate the island or result in his execution as a war criminal. If you wish to support the preservation of these historical accounts and see the outcome of Fertig's impossible gamble, please register your support by liking this presentation and subscribing to the channel. To execute this audacious plan, Fertig understood that he needed more than just a vision. He needed gravitas. In the rigid hierarchy of the Philippines, military rank was the only currency that mattered. He knew that Filipino soldiers and local leaders would likely dismiss the commands of a mere lieutenant colonel, especially with other officers of equal or higher rank scattered across the island. Consequently, Fertig orchestrated an unprecedented act of self-invention. He commissioned a local Filipino metalsmith to fashion 2 silver stars from scrap coinage. With steady nerves, Wendell Fertig, the mining engineer from Colorado, pinned the stars to his collar and unilaterally promoted himself to the rank of Brigadier General. By the break of dawn on September 12, 1942, Wendell Fertig formally issued a proclamation declaring himself the commander of all American forces on Mindanao. By noon of that same day, he had effectively cemented his status as the single most hunted individual on an island garrisoned by 50,000 hostile Japanese troops. However, Fertig's immediate and most pressing challenge was not the enemy, but the fragile nature of his own legitimacy. He was a self-appointed general commanding an army that did not exist, possessing no heavy weaponry, and operating in total isolation without any line of communication to General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters in Australia. The resistance movement on Mindanao was, at that stage, a chaotic fracture of disorganized splinter groups. Across the island, dozens of independent guerrilla bands operated with no central coordination. Some were disciplined remnants of the Philippine army who had refused to surrender. Others were patriotic civilian volunteers defending their homes. However, many were merely opportunistic bandits utilizing the fog of war as a convenient cover for looting and robbery. Compounding the chaos, these factions were often engaged in violent skirmishes with one another, just as frequently as they engaged the Japanese occupation forces. It was in the rugged, volcanic mountains south of Lake Lanao that Fertig secured his first significant tactical alliance. He encountered Captain Louis Morgan, a fiery officer of the Philippine Constabulary. Morgan was a mestizo of mixed American and Filipino heritage, who had been waging a relentless guerrilla war against the Japanese since the initial surrender. Despite his own combat experience, Morgan possessed a critical understanding of the island's socio-political dynamics. He realized that the disparate Filipino guerrilla factions would never coalesce under a Filipino commander. The landscape was too riddled with deep-seated tribal rivalries, religious schisms, and bitter personal feuds. Morgan recognized, however, that these factions might unify under an American flag. To the people of Mindanao, an American officer represented more than just military authority. He was a living symbol of the United States' pledge to return. His presence signified that they had not been abandoned to the occupation. Consequently, Morgan agreed to step aside and serve as Fertig's executive officer. In exchange, Fertig would become the public face of the resistance, the American general who embodied the tangible promise of liberation. Yet, even with this alliance, Fertig faced a demographic and cultural labyrinth that no military rank could easily navigate. Mindanao was not a monolithic society. It was a collection of distinct and often antagonistic worlds. In the northern provinces resided the Christian Filipinos, many of whom had been educated in the American school system, spoke fluent English, and identified with Western governance. In the south and west lay the domain of the Moros, fiercely independent Muslim clans who had successfully resisted foreign subjugation for 4 centuries, fighting against the Spanish, the Americans, and now the Japanese. The Moros were historically suspicious of outsiders, harboring a deep distrust not only for Christians and Americans, but often for rival Moro clans as well. Further complicating the map were the indigenous tribes of the highlands, pagan communities who had maintained their autonomy against all conquerors. Each of these groups possessed its own distinct dialect, its own rigid customs, and its own historical grievances. The Japanese occupation forces were adept at weaponizing these fissures, actively recruiting collaborators from every community to pit neighbor against neighbor and dismantle the resistance from within. The Japanese propaganda machine worked tirelessly to disseminate a corrosive narrative that the United States had abandoned the Philippines forever and that resistance was a futile exercise in self-destruction. This psychological warfare was buttressed by a vast network of paid informants, locals who were coerced or bribed with scarce commodities like rice and currency to report on guerrilla movements. Consequently, the environment was thick with paranoia. Every village Fertig entered presented a potential lethal trap, where a single betrayed whisper could lead a Japanese patrol directly to his location. Beyond the immediate threat of betrayal lay a profound strategic crisis. Fertig possessed no means of communicating with the Allied High Command in Australia. He had no way to verify to General MacArthur that he even existed, let alone that he had organized a viable resistance force. Without a line of communication, he could not request the vital supplies, weaponry, or ammunition required to sustain a war effort. His guerrilla forces were pitifully under-equipped, fighting with obsolete rifles, improvised shotguns, and traditional bolo knives. In some units, the logistical situation was so dire that men were allocated a single bullet to use against a Japanese adversary backed by heavy artillery, machine gun battalions, and air support. To bridge this impossible gap, Fertig needed a radio. However, he did not require a standard field set. He needed a high-frequency transmitter powerful enough to span the 2,000 miles of ocean separating Mindanao from Australia. This challenge was compounded by the fact that the Japanese had systematically confiscated or destroyed every piece of civilian communications equipment on the island to prevent exactly this kind of coordination. In late 1942, Fertig's search for a solution led him to a Filipino engineer named Placido Almendras. Prior to the war, Almendras had been employed by a mining company to maintain heavy electrical equipment. He possessed a deep theoretical understanding of radio mechanics and electronics, and crucially, he believed he could construct a functioning transmitter entirely from salvaged wreckage. For weeks, Almendras meticulously scavenged for components among the debris of the occupation, stripping copper wiring from the harnesses of wrecked trucks, salvaging vacuum tubes that had been buried by Filipino civilians before the Japanese invasion, and repurposing a small gasoline engine to serve as a generator. Piece by agonizing piece, he assembled a Frankenstein station in a jungle clearing, carefully shielded from Japanese reconnaissance aircraft by the triple canopy rainforest. The antenna array was strung high between two towering hardwood trees and camouflaged with vines to blend into the foliage. The generator required manual cranking to start, and the entire apparatus was designed with mobility in mind. The station could be dismantled and transported by a team of porters in under 30 minutes should enemy patrols encroach on their position. In February 1943, Almendras powered up the improvised transmitter for its inaugural test. The signal it produced was weak, and the frequency drifted unreliably, offering no guarantee that anyone on the other end was listening. Fertig had one crucial message to send, a single opportunity to prove to MacArthur that an American officer was still fighting on Mindanao, and to bring his invisible army into the fold of the wider war. The message was tapped out into the static of the Pacific ether, and Fertig settled in to wait for a reply that might never arrive. The silence of the jungle ether was finally broken by a faint, rhythmic crackle from Australia. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters had intercepted Fertig's transmission, but the initial reaction was not one of relief, but of deep suspicion. In the shadow war of the Pacific, radio deception was a common tactic. The Japanese Imperial Navy was notorious for operating counterfeit radio stations designed to lure Allied submarines into deadly ambushes. Consequently, MacArthur's intelligence staff demanded rigorous verification. They transmitted a series of challenge questions, highly specific, personal inquiries that no Japanese intelligence officer could possibly answer. They asked for the maiden name of his wife, the details of his hometown in Colorado, and the specific years of his university education. Fertig answered each query with precision, confirming his identity beyond a shadow of a doubt. However, even with his identity established, MacArthur's staff remained profoundly skeptical of the situation on the ground. The report read like a fabrication, a civilian mining engineer claiming to have organized a unified guerrilla army on an occupied island, a mere lieutenant colonel who had unilaterally promoted himself to the rank of Brigadier General. To the professional military class in Australia, this sounded less like a viable resistance movement and more like a Japanese trap, or perhaps the grandiose delusions of a man who had succumbed to jungle rot and lost his grip on reality. MacArthur's response was blunt and unequivocal. The message stripped Fertig of his self-appointed title, stating firmly that there would be no promotions to general rank for officers isolated in the Philippines. Fertig was ordered to revert immediately to his substantive rank of lieutenant colonel. If he expected any material support from the Allied powers, he would have to obey orders from Australia and provide tangible proof that his guerrilla force was more than a fantasy. Fertig accepted the official demotion with military discipline, yet he made a shrewd political calculation. He continued to wear the silver stars. To the War Department, he was a colonel, but on the ground in Mindanao, he remained the general. Fertig understood that to the Filipino tribesmen and Moro warriors, the rank carried the weight of sovereignty and authority. To take off the stars would be to admit weakness, but the radio contact achieved something far more important than rank. It confirmed to the resistance that the Americans had not forgotten them. Help was on the way. In March 1943, the dark waters off the northern coast of Mindanao were disturbed by the surfacing of the USS Tamber, a United States Navy submarine running a clandestine insertion mission. The vessel carried a single, high-value passenger, Commander Charles Parsons. Parsons was a unique asset in naval intelligence. He had lived in the Philippines extensively before the war and spoke fluent Tagalog. His mission was critical and binary. He was to conduct a comprehensive on-site evaluation of Fertig's operation and determine if this self-appointed general was a legitimate military asset or a liability suffering from insanity. What Parsons discovered upon landing stunned him. He did not find a chaotic band of refugees. He found a functioning state. Fertig had achieved the impossible, building a complex military and civil organization from absolute zero. The scattered, warring guerrilla bands were being methodically integrated into a cohesive command structure. Filipino officers were undergoing rigorous training in military discipline and tactics. An intricate intelligence network had been woven into the fabric of Japanese-occupied cities, providing real-time data on enemy movements. Coast Watcher stations were operational along the shoreline, tracking the flow of Japanese shipping. And incredibly, all of this was functioning effectively within territory ostensibly controlled by tens of thousands of Imperial Japanese troops. Parsons returned to Australia with a report that would change the course of the war in the Philippines. His recommendation was absolute. Fertig was not insane. He was a strategic genius. He was building exactly what MacArthur needed: a fully operational army behind enemy lines capable of generating intelligence, rescuing downed Allied pilots, and preparing the battle space for the eventual American invasion. The skepticism at headquarters evaporated. The supply lines were opened, and soon the submarines began arriving with regularity, bringing the weapons of war to the barge pilot of the jungle. The lifeline from Australia materialized in the form of American fleet submarines. The USS Tamber, the USS Thresher, and the USS Bowfin, gliding silently into the coastal waters of Mindanao under the cover of darkness. Each vessel carried a precious, if physically limited, cargo, typically 4 to 7 tons of bolt-action rifles, ammunition, high-grade medical supplies, and advanced radio equipment per trip. While this tonnage was negligible by the standards of a conventional European front, for a guerrilla army that had been subsisting on homemade Baltic shotguns and scavenged weaponry, these shipments represented a quantum leap in military capability. To effectively disseminate these assets, Fertig engineered a complex logistical nervous system that spanned the entire island. Under the cloak of night, supplies were offloaded onto hidden beaches, transferred to small, shallow-draft bancas to navigate the winding river systems, and finally loaded onto carabao-drawn carts for the slow, agonizing trek up muddy jungle trails into the volcanic highlands. Every single shipment had to traverse a gauntlet of enemy territory where Japanese patrols could emerge from the tree line at any moment. The Imperial Japanese Command could no longer ignore the shifting tide of the war. The tenor of the resistance had evolved from sporadic, disorganized harassment into a campaign of calculated, surgical violence. Ambush tactics were no longer random. They were synchronized attacks targeting specific strategic objectives. Bridges were demolished with professional explosives, supply convoys were interdicted with coordinated fire, and critical communication lines were systematically severed. It became undeniable that a central intelligence was now organizing the insurgency. Japanese intelligence officers, realizing that a single mind was directing the chaos, initiated a brutal counterintelligence campaign. They flooded the northern coastal regions with aggressive patrols, subjected captured guerrillas to intense interrogation, and tortured Filipino civilians to extract a single piece of actionable intelligence. Eventually, the name surfaced: Fertig, the American general hiding in the mountains. By the summer of 1943, the occupation forces had placed a substantial bounty on Wendell Fertig's head, a sum never officially recorded in the archives, but one sufficient to tempt any starving soul living under the crushing weight of the occupation. Fertig was now the most wanted individual on an island of 8 million people, yet his invisible army was only in its infancy. Crucially, Fertig understood a profound strategic truth that transcended mere ballistics. He realized that firearms alone could not hold Mindanao against an empire that could endlessly replenish its soldiers, artillery, and aircraft. To truly win, He had to build a structure that could not be bombed into submission. He could not merely command a resistance. He had to govern an island whose people refused to be ruled by Tokyo. Fertig was not just building a military force. He was forging a functioning civil government, a nation within a nation. By the middle of 1943, Wendell Fertig had achieved a feat of state building that rivaled his military accomplishments. He had effectively established a functioning civil government across the vast swathes of guerrilla-controlled territory. This administrative structure was not a crude improvisation, but a deliberate mirror of the pre-war Philippine Commonwealth, designed to project legitimacy and order in the face of chaos. Provincial governors were appointed and reported directly to Fertig's headquarters, while municipal officials managed local affairs, ensuring that the machinery of society continued to turn despite the occupation. Courts of law were reconvened to settle disputes between civilians, restoring a sense of justice that had vanished under Japanese martial law. A functioning postal system was implemented to carry messages between isolated towns, and jungle hospitals were constructed to treat not only wounded guerrillas, but also civilians suffering from tropical diseases. Perhaps most defiantly, schools were reopened, teaching children in English, a direct and perilous rejection of the Japanese mandate to enforce their own language and culture. The most audacious element of this shadow state was the creation of an independent economy. Fertig authorized the printing of currency, the guerrilla peso. These notes were printed on whatever paper stock could be scavenged, often using crude, hand-carved stamps and locally sourced inks. Physically, the bills were rough and amateurish, yet they circulated with the strength of genuine legal tender, because Filipino merchants accepted them based on a single, powerful assurance. Fertig pledged that upon the return of General MacArthur, the United States government would redeem every guerrilla peso at full face value. It was a promise Fertig had absolutely no legal authority to make, and one the U.S. Treasury had not sanctioned, but the people of Mindanao believed him. This civil government achieved what brute military force never could. It gave the Filipino population a tangible reason to support the resistance that transcended mere hatred of the Japanese. Fertig's territory offered the commodities that the occupation had destroyed: justice, education, medical care, and hope. As word of this sanctuary spread, a steady stream of displaced American servicemen began navigating the hazardous terrain to reach Fertig's headquarters. These were the survivors of the initial collapse, soldiers who had evaded the surrender order and hidden in the mountains, pilots who had been shot down over the jungle canopy, and sailors who had swum ashore from ships sunk in Philippine waters. By late 1943, the number of Americans serving under Fertig's direct command had swelled to 187. This was not merely an increase in manpower. It was an injection of specialized expertise. Former infantry officers took command of combat units, instilling professional discipline. Navy radio men professionalized the communications network, and Army Air Corps mechanics applied their technical skills to maintain and repair captured Japanese equipment. To manage this growing army, Fertig reorganized his forces into 6 distinct guerrilla divisions, each responsible for a specific geographic sector of Mindanao. Recognizing the impossibility of micromanaging a war across such difficult terrain, he granted his division commanders considerable operational independence, allowing them to adapt their strategies to local conditions and the unique strengths of their indigenous allies. In the northern provinces, Christian Filipino units utilized their familiarity with the road networks to execute devastating ambushes on Japanese supply convoys moving along the coastal highways. In the south, the tactics were more primal and terrifying. Moro fighters leveraged their ancestral knowledge of the mangrove swamps and river deltas to strike isolated Japanese outposts with silent lethality, vanishing back into the water before enemy reinforcements could even be mustered. Perhaps the most singular feat of engineering born from this desperation was the creation of the guerrilla navy. With no access to conventional naval vessels, Fertig's engineers cannibalized the wreckage of the war to forge a fleet of ad hoc warships. Small, shallow-draft merchant vessels were retrofitted with heavy machine guns, salvaged from the twisted fuselages of crashed American bombers. Other boats were mounted with crude, homemade cannons bored from iron pipes. In a display of ingenuity that bordered on the surreal, one vessel was armored using massive circular saw blades scavenged from abandoned lumber mills, welding the hardened steel into makeshift ballistic plating. These improvised leviathans terrorized Japanese coastal shipping, intercepting supply barges and patrol boats in the shallow waters where larger enemy destroyers could not follow. The audacity of this mosquito fleet culminated in an engagement that defies the conventional history of naval warfare. During a skirmish in the Bohol Sea, a guerrilla sailing ship, armed with a single 20mm cannon, managed to track and engage a low-flying Japanese medium bomber. The shell struck true, and the aircraft plummeted into the sea. It stands in the annals of history as likely the only confirmed instance during the entire Second World War in which a wind-powered sailing vessel successfully destroyed a modern enemy aircraft. Yet, while the combat forces fought for territory, the intelligence network fought for information, expanding at a rate that outpaced even the military mobilization. Fertig established a web of 58 clandestine radio stations across the breadth of Mindanao. A vast network of Coast Watcher posts was positioned along the strategic shorelines, monitoring the flow of Japanese merchant marine and naval traffic and relaying the data directly to MacArthur's headquarters. Deep within the Japanese-occupied cities, Filipino agents operated as shadows, conducting headcounts of garrison troops, mapping the layout of new fortifications, and identifying high-value targets for future strikes. This stream of intelligence became the lifeblood of the Allied naval campaign. When American submarines prowled the Philippine waters hunting enemy tonnage, they were guided to their kills by the precise coordinates gathered by Fertig's network. By June of 1944, MacArthur's Philippine Regional Section tallied 169 operational radio stations across the archipelago, but Fertig's organization on Mindanao remained the largest, most disciplined, and most effective of them all. His coast watchers logged every Japanese vessel that entered or departed Mindanao's ports, and his inland agents reported troop maneuvers within hours of their occurrence. For General MacArthur, who was meticulously planning the liberation of the Philippines, this intelligence was not merely useful. It was the foundational blueprint for the invasion. However, the Imperial High Command did not remain idle in the face of this growing threat. In May of 1943, recognizing that the resistance had evolved from a nuisance into a strategic liability, the Japanese launched their first major counteroffensive designed to crush Fertig's forces. Thousands of Imperial troops were mobilized to sweep through the northern provinces in a campaign of pacification. The operation was brutal and indiscriminate. Villages merely suspected of harboring or supplying the guerrillas were put to the torch, and civilians were systematically liquidated to serve as grim warnings to the populace. The Japanese commanders operated under the belief that a single, concentrated campaign of terror would break the spine of the movement forever. They had woefully miscalculated the resilience of the enemy they faced. The offensive of May 1943 was engineered to be overwhelming, utilizing a classic hammer and anvil tactic as three separate columns of infantry pushed into the mountains from different vectors, intending to trap the guerrillas in a tightening noose of steel. The Imperial Japanese offensive opened with a torrent of kinetic violence. Aerial bombardment rained down indiscriminately upon suspected guerrilla encampments, while the Imperial Navy tightened a steel noose around the island, effectively blockading the coastline to sever the critical submarine supply lifelines from Australia. The Japanese strategic objective was rooted in classic conventional warfare: to pin Fertig's forces between converging columns of heavy infantry and annihilate them in a decisive set-piece battle. However, Fertig had anticipated precisely this doctrine. He refused to give them the engagement they sought. Instead of digging in for a suicidal defensive stand, his forces simply evaporated. Implementing a predetermined contingency plan, the guerrilla units fragmented into small, autonomous cells and melted into the dense, triple-canopy rainforest. The headquarters staff buried their heavy radio transmitters and sensitive intelligence archives in waterproof caches before dispersing to prearranged sanctuary sites. Fertig himself became a ghost, adhering to a strict discipline of constant movement and never sleeping in the same location for 2 consecutive nights. Guided by indigenous Filipino scouts who navigated ancient trails that appeared on no Japanese military map, the Imperial columns slogged deeper into the unforgiving interior. Their prize was frustration. They captured nothing but abandoned campsites, cold fire pits, and empty supply depots. The jungle seemed to have swallowed their enemy whole. As the Japanese pushed further, the hunter became the prey. Patrols that ventured too far from the safety of the main columns were liquidated in sudden, violent ambushes. Sentries posted at the perimeter of Japanese bivouacs were killed silently under the cover of darkness. Critical supply lines were severed by improvised explosive devices, fashioned by guerrilla engineers from unexploded Japanese ordnance. After 6 grueling weeks, the offensive crumbled under its own weight. The Japanese troops, ravaged by malaria, dysentery, and physical exhaustion, were demoralized by the psychological toll of fighting a phantom enemy they could neither find nor fix. Defeated by the terrain and the tactics, they withdrew to the relative safety of their coastal garrisons. The resilience of Fertig's organization was displayed in the aftermath. Within days of the enemy's departure, the guerrillas emerged from the shadows to reoccupy their former positions. The buried radios were unearthed and brought back on the air. The supply networks resumed their flow, and the civil government reopened its offices as if the invasion had never happened. The Japanese High Command attempted to replicate this strategy in October of 1943 and again in early 1944. Yet, each operation adhered to the same feudal cycle: an initial aggressive thrust into guerrilla territory, followed by weeks of fruitless searching, mounting casualties from disease and hit-and-run attacks, and an eventual, humiliating withdrawal. With each failure, the guerrillas returned stronger and better equipped than before. Slowly, the Japanese commanders began to comprehend the terrifying nature of their predicament. They realized they were not merely fighting a rogue military unit. They were fighting an entire population. They faced a reality where every humble Filipino farmer was a potential intelligence asset, every village served as a clandestine supply depot, and every bend in a jungle trail was a potential kill zone. To truly pacify Mindanao would require a garrison force large enough to occupy every town, patrol every road, and monitor every civilian, a logistical impossibility. In their frustration, the Japanese resorted to terror, but the strategy backfired catastrophically. They burned villages to the ground to punish suspected sympathizers, executed civilians as public examples, and tortured prisoners to extract information. Every act of calculated brutality committed by the occupation forces served only to drive the populace deeper into Fertig's fold. Farmers who had once attempted to maintain a precarious neutrality found themselves radicalized after witnessing the summary execution of their neighbors. Young men who had previously sought only to evade the conflict now flooded into the recruitment centers, eager to volunteer for combat units. In their attempt to crush the resistance through terror, the Japanese were inadvertently recruiting the very army they sought to destroy. By the middle of 1944, Japanese intelligence estimates suggested that Fertig now commanded a force exceeding 30,000 armed guerrillas. However, the true strength of the resistance was impossible to quantify, as Fertig's organization had effectively erased the demarcation between soldier and civilian. The war had become total. A man might labor as a rice farmer in the morning sun, only to carry crates of ammunition to a mountain camp in the afternoon. A fisherman might transport critical supplies by banca under the cover of darkness, then sell his catch in a Japanese-controlled market the very next day. To the occupation forces, the entire population had become a hostile entity. The Japanese High Command in Manila was forced to confront a grim strategic reality. Suppressing the insurgency on Mindanao would require a troop commitment larger than the garrison currently occupying the entire Philippine archipelago. These were resources that were desperately needed elsewhere to counter the relentless American advance across the Pacific. Staff officers calculated that 24 additional battalions would be required solely to secure rear areas against guerrilla attacks. The math was unsustainable. It demanded 1 soldier to protect supply lines for every 3 soldiers facing the impending American invasion. A captured Japanese staff document summarized this strategic paralysis with a single, resigned sentence. "It is impossible to fight the enemy and at the same time suppress the activities of the guerrillas." In October of 1944, the geopolitical landscape shifted seismically. American forces stormed the beaches of the island of Leyte, located just 300 miles north of Mindanao. General MacArthur had returned. The liberation of the Philippines had formally begun, and Fertig's guerrillas stood on the precipice of their greatest test. The arrival of the invasion force fundamentally altered the mission. For 2 agonizing years, Fertig's forces had operated in isolation, fighting a desperate war of survival fueled only by clandestine submarine deliveries and captured enemy equipment. Now, they were transformed into the forward element of a massive invasion force. Every piece of intelligence they gathered, every Japanese soldier they eliminated, and every supply line they severed directly facilitated the American advance. The submarines began to arrive with a new and frantic urgency. The supply effort escalated dramatically with the arrival of the USS Narwhal, one of the true leviathans of the Pacific Fleet. This massive submarine possessed the capacity to deliver a staggering 100 tons of cargo in a single clandestine run. The technological disparity that had plagued the resistance for years vanished overnight. Crates of modern, semi-automatic Moen-Garand rifles arrived to replace the antique bolt-action Springfields and crude, homemade weapons that had armed the insurgency since the beginning. Cases of fresh ammunition allowed units to transition from a mindset of desperate scavenging to one of sustained offensive operations. Advanced radios, surgical-grade medical equipment, and military-grade high explosives flooded into the guerrilla camps scattered across Mindanao's interior. With this influx of materiel came new, aggressive directives from General MacArthur's headquarters. The strategic mandate was clear. Fertig's forces were to launch a campaign of total interdiction against Japanese communications. They were ordered to sever telephone lines, demolish key bridges, and liquidate couriers. The objective was the complete strategic isolation of the Japanese garrison on Mindanao, rendering them deaf and blind, unable to coordinate with forces on neighboring islands, unable to summon reinforcements, and unable to report the movements of the encroaching American fleet. The guerrillas executed these orders with ruthless efficiency, initiating a campaign of systematic infrastructure destruction. In November of 1944, sabotage teams severed the primary hardened telephone cables linking the Japanese High Command in Davao with their outlying garrisons across the island. When repair crews were dispatched to restore the lines, they walked into prepared kill zones and were ambushed before they could unspool their wire. Forced to rely on wireless communication, the Japanese found no sanctuary there either. Guerrilla direction-finding teams triangulated the positions of enemy transmitters and relayed the precise coordinates to American aircraft. Within hours, Japanese radio stations were obliterated by precision airstrikes, bombed into absolute silence. Simultaneously, The island's transportation network collapsed under the weight of constant attack. Bridges that had withstood years of minor harassment were now vaporized by American-supplied high explosives. Vital roadways were choked with felled timber and the burning husks of disabled vehicles. Japanese convoys, which had once traversed the interior with relative impunity, now required heavy armored escorts to move even short distances. Even with such protection, ambushes inflicted a steady, bleeding toll of casualties. The logistical friction was catastrophic. A standard battalion march between garrisons, which had once required 2 days, now dragged on for 2 hellish weeks. The volume of high-grade intelligence flowing into General MacArthur's headquarters swelled into a torrent. The network of Coast Watcher stations, now fully mature, provided real-time tracking of every Japanese naval and merchant vessel navigating the island's waters. Deep cover operatives embedded within the city of Davao conducted meticulous surveillance, counting individual troop numbers, identifying specific unit insignia to determine the order of battle, and mapping defensive fortifications with cartographic precision. Consequently, when American strategic planners began finalizing the blueprints for the invasion of Mindanao, they possessed a level of battlefield transparency rarely achieved in the Pacific theater. They knew the enemy's dispositions better than the Japanese commanders knew their own. Facing this intelligence overmatch, the Japanese high command was gripped by a paralyzed indecision. The geopolitical walls were closing in. American forces were slicing through the Philippine archipelago. Leyte had already fallen, and the main island of Luzon was under heavy assault. Every available bayonet was desperately needed to repel the primary American invasion force. Yet the Japanese faced a brutal strategic dilemma. Withdrawing troops from Mindanao to reinforce the north would leave their remaining garrisons hopelessly vulnerable to being overrun by Fertig's swelling guerrilla army. Conversely, maintaining a strong occupation force on Mindanao meant denying critical manpower to the fronts where the Americans were actively landing. The guerrillas had successfully engineered a state of total strategic paralysis. In a final, desperate gambit to break the stalemate, Japanese headquarters authorized one last major offensive against Fertig's mountain strongholds. The logic was born of necessity. If the guerrilla infrastructure could be shattered before the American fleet arrived, tens of thousands of Imperial troops could be freed for redeployment. In the opening months of 1945, Japanese armored and infantry columns once again surged into the highlands. However, history merely repeated itself with grim predictability. The Japanese forces encountered the same phantom enemy that had plagued them for years: deserted encampments, vanishing adversaries, and a jungle that seemed to bleed them at every turn. They faced relentless ambushes on every trail and mounting casualties from an opponent who steadfastly refused to offer a decisive battle. This final, futile counterinsurgency operation was still sputtering to its inconclusive end when the horizon filled with ships, and American forces began their amphibious landings on the shores of Mindanao. On April 17, 1945, the amphibious assault craft of the U.S. Army's 24th Infantry Division churned toward the beaches of Parang on the western coast of Mindanao. The American commanders and infantrymen crouched in the landing boats were steeled for a violent reception, fully anticipating the same brutal, contested landings they had endured on other Pacific islands. They expected fortified pillboxes, interlocking fields of machine gun fire, and weeks of grueling attrition to secure a beachhead. Instead, as the ramps dropped into the surf, they were met with a sight that defied all tactical expectations. The beach was silent. The defenses had already been neutralized. What they found ashore astonished the seasoned combat troops. Colonel Wendell Fertig's guerrillas had not merely harassed the enemy. They had effectively cleared the landing zones before the first American boot touched the sand. The Japanese units that should have been manning the coastal fortifications were either dead, incapacitated, or desperately retreating into the interior, trapped by a complex web of guerrilla roadblocks. As the American columns moved inland, they were not greeting a ragtag band of survivors, but linking up with a disciplined, uniformed paramilitary force that had been engaged in active combat for 3 years. These were not just guides. They were operational assets, intelligence officers who possessed detailed maps of every remaining Japanese position, and hardened veterans who had already shouldered the burden of the fighting. The strategic landscape of Mindanao had been fundamentally altered. The Japanese garrison, once a formidable force of 50,000 men, was shattered, its command structure decapitated, and its units scattered into disarray. Fertig had, in a very literal sense, delivered the island to General MacArthur on a platter. The timeline for the liberation of Mindanao collapsed. A campaign that planners had projected would take months of bloody fighting was accomplished in a matter of weeks. The American advance, expected to be a slow grind against entrenched fanatics, transformed into a rapid pursuit of broken enemy formations that were already reeling from years of irregular warfare. The tables had turned completely. The Japanese soldiers who had spent 3 years terrorizing the Filipino civilian population now found themselves the quarry, hunted relentlessly through the same dense jungles where they had once chased Fertig. By early June 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Mindanao had effectively ceased to exist. While isolated pockets of starving troops held out in the remote mountain fastnesses, they posed no strategic threat to the Allied occupation. An island that had tied down 50,000 Imperial troops was secured with minimal American casualties, a feat of economy of force almost without parallel in the Pacific theater. Military historians would later quantify the sheer magnitude of Fertig's achievement. Post-war analysis indicated that his guerrilla forces were responsible for killing over 7,000 Japanese soldiers during the occupation, a number that rivals the lethality of many conventional divisions. Furthermore, they had wounded thousands more, and perhaps most importantly, had tied down an entire field army that could have been decisively deployed elsewhere in the Pacific to oppose the American advance. The final vindication came when General Douglas MacArthur summoned Fertig to his headquarters. The Supreme Commander, who had once dismissed the mining engineers' reports as the delusions of a madman or the deception of a Japanese trap, now welcomed him with full honors. In a rare admission of revised judgment, MacArthur praised Fertig as one of the most effective and resourceful unconventional warfare commanders in the history of the American military. The mining engineer from Colorado had proven that with enough courage, ingenuity, and the will to resist, a single man could indeed forge an army from the wilderness and help win a war. Wendell Fertig's accomplishment was without precedent in modern military history. He had achieved what no war college curriculum had ever theorized was possible. Operating deep within hostile territory, devoid of logistical support or external reinforcement, he had constructed a fully functional army from the ground up and successfully held an island landmass larger than Taiwan against a technologically superior modern military force. The accolades that followed were commensurate with the magnitude of his achievement. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism, with the citation explicitly noting his persistence in the face of a substantial bounty on his head and his relentless operations in constant proximity to the enemy. He also received the Distinguished Service Medal for his organizational genius in forging a well-disciplined and highly effective fighting force that successfully confined the Imperial Army to limited, heavily fortified enclaves. The Philippine government bestowed upon him its highest military honors, and the civilian population of Mindanao revered him as a true liberator. However, for Fertig, the most profound recognition did not come from medals or government decrees, but from the men who had served alongside him in the green hell of the jungle. It came from the Filipino guerrillas who had charged tanks with homemade shotguns, from the American soldiers and sailors who had chosen 3 years of starvation and danger over the humiliation of surrender, from the coast watchers who had risked summary execution to transmit vital coordinates, and from the radio operators who had kept the lifeline to Australia open under impossible conditions. Together, they had built something historic, a resistance army that had not merely survived the occupation but had played a pivotal role in winning the war. The strategic ramifications of their resistance extended far beyond the shores of Mindanao. Across the entire Philippine archipelago, the cumulative pressure of guerrilla forces had effectively pinned down 288,000 Japanese troops. This strategic attrition was staggering in its scale. Approximately 1/4 of the Imperial Army's total strength in the Philippines was occupied solely with the drudgery of rear area security, paralyzed by the constant threat of partisan attacks. The tactical mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Every Japanese battalion assigned to guard a supply depot was a battalion that could not oppose American Marines storming the beaches. Every soldier deployed to hunt guerrillas in the jungle was a soldier absent from the defensive fortifications along the coast. The Filipino resistance had effectively acted as a massive force multiplier, exponentially increasing American combat power without the expenditure of American lives. Japanese commanders, in their posthumous analysis, recognized this reality too late. Their own after-action reports candidly acknowledged the impossible strategic dilemma they had faced. To suppress the guerrillas required a massive commitment of troops. However, pulling those troops from frontline combat units fatally weakened their coastal defenses. Weakened defenses allowed for a more rapid American advance, and a faster advance left the Japanese with even less time and fewer resources to suppress the insurgency. The cycle of defeat was mathematically unbreakable. In the corridors of the Pentagon, military planners began a meticulous study of Fertig's operational methods. It was a humbling realization. A civil engineer with absolutely no formal training in special forces or commando tactics had accomplished what entire conventional armies often could not. Fertig had intuitively grasped a fundamental truth that would become the cornerstone of modern asymmetric warfare. Guerrilla combat is not primarily about attrition or killing the enemy. Rather, it is about constructing a political and social organization, establishing legitimacy, and winning the hearts and minds of the indigenous population. It is the art of making the occupier's position untenable through 1,000 small, debilitating cuts, rather than seeking a single, decisive Clausewitzian battle. These hard-won lessons would go on to reshape American military doctrine for decades to come. As the geopolitical landscape shifted toward the emerging Cold War, the capability to organize and sustain resistance movements deep behind enemy lines became a top strategic priority. The United States military realized it needed a cadre of officers who possessed the specific, unconventional skill set that Fertig had mastered in the jungles of Mindanao. The Second World War had concluded, but Wendell Fertig's most enduring contribution to military science was only just beginning. Wendell Fertig returned to the United States in late 1945. He was 54 years old, but the jungle had exacted a heavy physiological price. He had spent 3 years living as a fugitive, hunted by a relentless army, surviving on meager rations of rice and sheer determination. His hair had turned prematurely white, and his body was ravaged by the cumulative effects of malnutrition and repeated bouts of malaria. Yet, while his body was exhausted, his mind remained sharp and focused on the future. American military planners, looking toward the looming confrontation with the Soviet Union, recognized that future conflicts might require exactly the type of irregular warfare expertise Fertig had demonstrated. They needed the institutional ability to organize resistance movements, to raise proxy armies from local populations, and to wage unconventional wars against numerically superior conventional forces. Consequently, Fertig was assigned to help architect a new kind of military capability, a unit dedicated specifically to the dark arts of special operations and psychological warfare. From 1951 to 1953, Wendell Fertig occupied a pivotal role within the military establishment, serving as the Special Forces Plans Officer and subsequently as the Deputy Chief of Psychological Warfare at Army Headquarters in Washington, D.C. In this capacity, he became one of the seminal architects of the Psychological Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. This institution would eventually evolve into the world-renowned John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School, the spiritual and tactical home of the United States Army Special Forces, the Green Berets. The intellectual lineage of American unconventional warfare is direct and undeniable. For decades, every Special Forces soldier trained at Fort Bragg was indoctrinated in strategies and principles that traced their genealogy directly back to the improvisational genius Fertig had demonstrated in the jungles of Mindanao. Fertig retired from active military service in the mid-1950s, quietly concluding a career that had fundamentally altered the American understanding of asymmetric warfare. He returned to his civilian roots in Colorado, where he managed a mining concern until his passing on March 24, 1975, at the age of 74. True to his character, he never sought the limelight nor attempted to capitalize on his wartime exploits. He never penned a memoir to polish his own reputation, preferring instead to let the historical record and the testimony of his contemporaries speak for his legacy. However, in the Philippines, the memory of the general remained indelible. Upon his return to Mindanao in the post-war years, the reception was overwhelming. Thousands of Filipinos lined the streets to welcome him, many weeping openly as they sang, "God Bless America," to the man who had stood with them when all hope seemed lost. To these people, Fertig had provided the most vital commodity of all during the crushing darkness of the occupation. It was not merely the weapons or the medical supplies he had delivered. It was the psychological lifeline of hope, the tangible proof that they had not been abandoned by the world, and the enduring promise that liberation was inevitable. His strategic brilliance has since been codified by military scholars. One prominent historian ranked Wendell Fertig among the 10 greatest guerrilla leaders in human history, placing his name alongside legendary figures such as T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, and Mao Zedong. It stands as a singular testament to the unpredictable nature of history. A mining engineer from Colorado who, prior to 1942, had never commanded a single soldier in battle, yet who rose to master the art of war and defeat an empire from the shadows. Wendell Fertig stands as a singular anomaly in the history of modern conflict. A man who constructed a cohesive army of 35,000 soldiers from a disparate collection of displaced refugees hiding in the rainforest. He was a commander who successfully held a strategic landmass against 50,000 enemy combatants for 3 agonizing years, equipping his forces with ammunition improvised from brass curtain rods and scavenged scrap metal. While his tactical genius was studied in war colleges, his memory was most fervently preserved by the Philippine government and the veterans organizations that honored his surviving guerrillas. The story of the general passed from generation to generation, evolving into local folklore. The American who refused to surrender, who pledged his honor that General MacArthur would return, and who kept that fragile promise alive through 3 years of total war. Fertig understood a fundamental truth that formal military academies often struggled to quantify. He realized that wars are not determined solely by industrial capacity or kinetic dominance. True victory is achieved by individuals who believe their cause is worth the ultimate sacrifice, who place absolute trust in their leadership, and who can visualize a future worth fighting for. In the darkest days of the occupation, Fertig provided the people of Mindanao with all 3 of these intangible necessities. 50,000 Imperial Japanese soldiers spent 3 years hunting a single American civil engineer. They never captured him. They never dismantled his organization. And ultimately, they never truly conquered his island. History often remembers great men for the specific battles they won or the territories they seized. Wendell Fertig, however, deserves to be remembered for a different kind of achievement. For the army he built from nothing, for the functioning nation he created within the jungle, and for the flame of hope he sheltered when the rest of the world had gone dark. If this narrative moved you, and if you believe in the importance of preserving these forgotten chapters of history, we ask that you register your support by liking this presentation. Every interaction helps the algorithm share this history with a wider audience, ensuring that these stories do not fade into obscurity. Please subscribe and activate notifications, as we are dedicated to rescuing these accounts from the dusty archives of the past. Stories of engineers and guerrillas who saved lives with homemade radios and raw courage. We also invite you to join our global community. Whether you are watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, the Philippines, or anywhere else in the world, you are part of the effort to keep these memories alive. Please leave a comment below stating your location, or let us know if a member of your family served in the Pacific Theater. Thank you for your time, and thank you for helping us ensure that the legacy of Wendell Fertig does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping to make that possible.